Welcome to the King of Iron Fist Tournament 7. Leroy Smith. Welcome to the King of Iron Fist Tournament's Leroy Smith. New challenger. Get ready for the next battle. Round one. Fight. Perfect. Round two. Fight. KO. Round three. Fight. KO. Round four. Fight. KO. Final round. Fight. KO. Get ready for the next battle.
Kaname Tosen.
Fight. KO. Round
Hey
two.
Thomas, what's up, man?
Fight.
It's thanks, man. Thanks. I think I'm not there yet. I don't have any defense at all.
Round
That's
three.
really my problem. I don't have any defense.
Fight.
No.
KO.
As soon as they know my weaknesses, that's going to be my problem. Ah, what? Ah!
You lose. ready for the next battle.
I think these guys already figured out my weaknesses.
Fight.
What?
KO. Round 2. Fight.
What? Nope.
KO. Round 3. Fight.
He keeps popping up that move. Ooh.
KO. Round 4. Fight.
Whoa, why did I jump?
KO. You're going out. Get ready for the next battle.
The only thing I like about Leroy, playing Leroy, is that I don't get stressed with how I execute the moves. So from time to time, if I just want to play Tekken and not feeling stressful,
Fight.
for sure I'm gonna pick up Leroy.
KO. Round 2. Fight. KO. Round 3. Fight. KO.
Do not roll.
Round
Tech
4.
roll.
Fight.
Oh, what?
KO. You win.
You're going out with nothing to show for it.
Get ready for the next battle.
I think right now Leroy is the easiest character in Tekken. So if you just want to play Tekken and not feeling stressful, get Leroy.
KO. Round 2. Fight. KO. Round 3.
It's gonna get demoted.
Fight.
Boom, boom. 1, 2.
Round 4. Fight.
What?
KO. You lose. Get ready for the next battle.
I love the electrics. I wish I could use Mishimas, but I can't.
Round 1. Fight. KO. Round 2. Fight.
This is gonna hurt. You're done.
No, he's not dead. What the heck? I escaped. Ooh. That missed.
Round 3. Fight.
Ooh, what?
KO. Round 4. Fight.
This is gonna hurt.
It's like nothing.
Great. Final round. Fight.
Go, sugar.
I honestly didn't. What the heck? That was supposed to be sugar. That was supposed to be sugar.
You win.
Oh, he doesn't want to play anymore. So I'm just gonna have to wait in the lobby again.
New challenger. Get ready for the next battle.
I hope it's not gonna be King or Claudio. Oh, okay, that's fine. Aggressiveness A+. Okay. Oh, defensive. Hey, Thomas, thanks for the follow, man.
Round one. Fight. KO. Round two. Fight.
Ah, that's where his defense go. Oh.
KO. Round three. Fight.
Ooh, that damage.
KO.
What?
Round four. Fight.
Bottom? B-O T-T-O-M.
KO.
Did you get it? Good.
Get ready for the next battle. Round one. Fight.
Oh, you didn't finish it. You dropped it.
KO.
Oh, so.
Round two. Fight.
Why doesn't it?
KO.
That's,
Round
doesn't do the
three.
juggles.
Fight.
Do the juggles.
KO. Round four. Fight. KO. Final round. Fight. Great.
Come on, sugar.
Oh, come on.
And he doesn't want to play.
Peanut butter banana. Oh, they ready for that.
That's the problem with playing Leroy. Nobody wants to play against Leroy.
Oh my god. What is this?
New challenger.
Kaname Toast. Bankai!
Get ready for the next battle. Battle.
You stupid Baldy! You stupid! Get out of here!
Hey, Prince.
Baldy, come here, you stupid! Get off!
Prince?
Ow. I just died.
Round one.
It's gonna be hard.
Fight.
Oh my god!
This is gonna hurt.
I was going
You're
to get
dumb.
that sword.
KO.
Your turn.
Round 2. Fight.
You can do this! You can do this!
Flying dragon.
3. Fight.
Ow!
KO. Round 4. Fight. KO. You win.
You're going out with nothing.
Get ready for the next battle.
Try. Oh, tama na, rest.
Round 1. Fight.
Ah.
KO. Round 2. Fight.
What? Four, three, two,
Great. Round 3. Fight.
Why are you laughing?
KO. Round 4. Fight.
I almost failed. This is like-
KO.
I failed.
You really can't rely on Sugar.
You're going out with nothing to show for it.
Get ready for the next battle.
Oh no, not the noob is stinky. Noob is stinky. Stinky, stinky.
Round one. Fight.
Why did I jump?
KO. Round two. Fight. KO. Round three. Fight.
Oh, that's nice. Look at that damage.
KO. Round four. Fight.
Try eating. Huh?
KO.
Donuts.
You win.
You're going out with nothing to show for.
Get ready for the next battle.
I rounded off this.
Hey,
What are those?
what? What do you think? What do you think? What are these? What do you think?
Presents. Ah!
Why you're so nice this year?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's just open it later, okay?
Open it up.
Time to take out the trash.
Round one. Fight.
Not now, later. Up.
Not yet.
I don't think it.
KO. Round two. Fight.
Let's take a video and say Merry Christmas, everyone. Oh, okay.
KO. Round three. Fight.
What the heck?
You lose.
Oh, that was a third.
Get ready for the next battle.
Get on board with Leroy now. Leroy! Leroy! Gonna be
Round
Tozen.
one. Fight.
Yeah, feel for it.
KO. Round two.
See Emmy?
Fight.
Oh.
KO. Round three.
Done?
Fight.
Your second donut? My goodness.
KO. Round four. Fight. KO. Final round. Fight.
What?
KO. You lose.
Get ready for the next battle.
Round
Let's get it
one.
on.
Fight. KO. Round two. Fight.
I'm done.
Yes, it just say Merry Christmas, everyone.
There is no way you can call Sugar in that distance.
KO. Round three. Fight.
That's nice.
No, that's not the video.
KO. Round four. Fight.
Ito mo mabali? Hindi. Ano mag-video? Ito mo mabali?
Oh. Paman mo ba?
KO.
Nope.
Wala akong gamot.
Final
Okay.
round.
Let's start now.
Fight.
What's that? Do the dab. Higher. Do the dab. Okay. Let's start. Merry Christmas! Again. After we go. Merry Christmas, everyone! Happy
That was so punishable. He knew
Merry Christmas,
Leroy was such punishable in that.
2019! Yeah, advance Happy New Year! Oh, come on. No! That I don't like nonsense. Read! Read it.
You win.
need to read them. Read.
You're going out with nothing to show for it.
Auntie.
I bet he doesn't want to play anymore after that. Oh, that's nice.
Get ready for the next battle.
Guy. Mommy's nickname is Guy, and this is her daddy, Dindo. So, this is from us to Auntie Fe. And this one, to from us.
Round
For
1.
you.
Fight.
Hey, the video is not right. I can't breathe. No. Hindi na ako kayong unaw. Okay. Unaw.
Daddy is a loser.
Come on, friends. Come here. Let's do it again.
My uncle.
Daddy, do it so
He didn't ask.
Kung talagang okay ba ang video? Unaw.
KO.
I'll come here.
Fight.
Friends, come back. That's for Auntie Faye. Come here now. That's Auntie Faye. Put it down. Okay. Have Merry Christmas, everybody. 1, 2, 3, go. Everyone. Prepare yourself. Happy New Year. We wish you a Merry Christmas.
KO.
Go. We wish you.
Round 3. Fight. KO.
Alright.
That's why we need
Round
to take a video properly.
Fight.
We're gonna put it in the YouTube. You want them to see you crazy? Come on, let's do it. Properly now. Properly now. Okay? Go. And a Happy New Year.
I'm no longer focused on my game.
Wish you a Merry Christmas. We
Go,
wish you
sugar.
a Merry Christmas. And a Happy New Year. That's it.
That was such a missed opportunity. I was able to call Sugar in that distance, and Sugar hit him.
Get ready for the next
That was supposed to be the maximum damage, but I wasn't focused on the game.
Prince! Later, Antifa's not yet here.
round one.
That's
Fight.
how. That's your patience. Control it. No! Santa Claus don't like naughty kids.
You need to wait, Prince.
That's why, because we're back. Don't be back. Prince, this is Christmas time. You need to follow the rules. The rules will be open later. Not now. Okay, don't think it. There's a gift here. Look for the gift.
Round two. Fight. KO. Round three. Fight. You win.
Or a paper. Go with the paper. Paper there.
Get ready for the next battle.
Huh?
I think paper don't work. I think that work. I think that paper.
You still got your cardboard here.
Oh.
Oh. Either side.
Round one. Fight. KO.
It dropped it.
Round two. Fight.
Too bad I wasn't able to parry it.
This is gonna hurt.
KO. Round three.
Waste of opportunity. Ooh, that was far. I tried.
Round 4.
Fight.
I tried.
You lose.
Get ready for the next battle.
Oh, Mike, I have a deal.
What?
Round 1.
Use a
Fight.
wooden.
What the heck?
KO. Round 2.
Can't get anything else out of it.
Fight. KO. Round 3. Fight.
Oh.
KO. Round 4. Fight.
Get a pay for that. Oh, that's nice.
KO.
That was nice.
Final round. Fight.
I guess it's
Ooh, Mike, look at this. Mike, look at this.
Oh, I don't have a cane anymore. Just all sugar.
No sugar.
KO. You lose.
Get ready for the next battle.
Sticky Swanee. You. It looks like a blob. Mark, it looks like
Round
a blob.
1.
Fight.
He's got 2 wins already.
KO. Round 2. Fight.
Go, sugar.
No! He didn't! I was supposed to be.
Fight.
Forgot about the 1-inch punch.
You win.
But I only get 400. Oh, okay. Yeah. And we're gonna have to wait again.
Challenger. Get ready for the next battle.
Mine, it looks like water. Painful goes.
Round 1.
Ooh, Steve.
Fight.
Ah, he dropped it.
KO.
Oh, these guys
Round
susah.
2. Fight.
Naruto ne. Ah! Dude.
KO. Round 3.
Steve Fox.
Fight.
What?
KO. Round 4. Fight. round. Fight.
My turn. Wait.
Great.
Because usually with if
You
it's
lose.
usually fireworks.
They do fireworks Christmas. They do.
Go! Jama, maka last year, every year, for 2 years, ako dari wala.
Daddy said
Tapos,
Asa man ta nag-Christmas?
London, wala. New Year ang fireworks.
Dito ka tayo lajuan.
Kaya nga, wala fireworks dari.
Lahi man ari.
Ha?
Lahi man ari.
Mga nene yung kunin mga milagro dari ibang fireworks.
New challenger. Get ready for the next battle.
I don't eat that.
I'm not going to eat it.
No, don't put it in your face. Come on. I didn't buy that to put it in your face.
Mine were metal paintball.
Juggernaut.
Metal?
Yeah.
That's the
Round 1.
3 bars.
Fight.
metal is different.
KO. Round 2. Fight. KO. Round 3. Fight.
Do not move.
You win. Get ready for the next battle.
My, this is disgusting. This is disgusting.
Yeah.
Do you like it? You like it? It's fine.
Round 1. Fight.
Mine is not fun.
KO.
Doesn't really make use of it.
Round 2. Fight.
Yeah, he is disgusting, man.
KO.
By far, he's the easiest.
Fight.
Oh, you want pressure? You want pressure?
Round 4.
Nah, if you do that all the time, most people rage quit. And as you know, if you use Leroy, you're gonna end up in the lobby most of the time, waiting. You have to wait. You have to be patient. Yeah, it is. I mean, the only reason that
Round 1.
we play Leroy is that we don't want to be stressful. I wanna parry that. Ah, nope. Sugar.
KO.
He should, man.
Fight.
He is the easiest character so far. He's got trap.
Round 3. Fight.
I want to parry the Hadouken. You can't. He doesn't do Hadouken.
Round 4. Fight.
I haven't really got any character. To be honest, I don't have any character that is that's best, I think. I'm just a casual player. I do play Tekken just for the fun of it. I'm not really that competitive.
Round 1. Fight.
Ah, I forgot to parry it.
KO. Round 2. Fight.
Ooh, that was I was waiting.
KO. Round 3. Fight.
I was waiting for that.
KO. You win. Get ready for the next battle. Round one. Fight.
I can't. That was. Oh.
KO. Round two. Fight.
Ooh, that's nice.
It's because of that slime.
What am I doing?
Perfect. Round
Trying to
three.
parry the Hadouken.
Fight. KO. Round four. Fight. KO. Final round. Fight.
Oh, that was my cane.
KO. You lose.
What? It's only plus 9, minus 90. Oh, that's.
Get ready for the next battle.
Oh, that is why. Because it's just a juggernaut. But anyway, that's fine.
Slimy.
We just want to play. We didn't care about the ranks. As long as he continues to fight, then we'll fight.
Fight.
Ah, that was a.
KO.
Should have parried that.
Round.
You should try Leroy, man.
Fight.
He's the easiest character so far. Ah.
KO. Round
Movie?
fight. KO. Round four. Fight.
All right.
KO. Final round. Fight. KO. ready for the next battle. Round 1. Fight. KO. Round 2. Fight. KO. Round 3. Fight. KO. You win. Get ready for the next battle. Round 1. Fight. KO. Round 2. Fight. KO. Round 3. Fight. KO. Round 4. Fight. KO.
You're done.
KO. You win.
You're going out with nothing to show for it.
Get ready for the next battle.
Oh, sige lang. Ingat.
Oh! No! How could you? Oh no!
Round 1. Fight. KO. Round 2. Fight.
Help! Tornado launch.
KO. Round 3. Fight.
Yang mana Roy?
KO. Round 4. Fight.
So, rasa mo dun si ate?
KO.
Ha? Kape? Kanang kuan? Prince, get the Buggle. We'll play Buggle.
No! This is
Come on, let's play. Let's play with mommy.